The technology absolutely plays a role, and it's intertwined into a lot of what I do. The question, of course, is whether or not everyone's at the same technological level or not. So one of the reasons that the Brits were so successful is not only were they an island, so the technologies of deep water navigation worked better for them than they did for anyone else. They were also then the pioneers of what we now call the Industrial Revolution. And for a good century and a half, it really was just them that had mastered those technologies. And so, for the purpose of imperial expansion, for a century and a half, the Brits literally brought a gun to a knife fight over and over and over and did very well. But as soon as the technology started to spread to other entities, we went to a broad-scale wars in which the Brits were a player, not the player. And ultimately, we ended up with all the colonies breaking away, because even if you're at the top of the line for tech and your opponent is at the bottom of the line, but you're in the same technological suite, then it comes down to things like numbers. 30,000 Brits occupied India until they couldn't.
Right.
The most recent data we've got out of the Chinese suggests that their population actually peaked back in 2003, and that they've been overcounting their population by perhaps as many as 100 million, all who would have been born since the one-child policy, and most of whom are probably women. So the Chinese demography is actually more terminal already than the German or the Russian or the Korean demography, and that we can see that in adjacent related numbers such as workforce compensation rates. We've seen labor costs in China go up by about a factor of 15 since 1999, but productivity's only doubled. So technology has not gotten its hooks into China to the degree that it's been able to shift the pattern at all. In terms of technology in general, there are a couple things that you need to have a thriving tech sector. You need a lot of young people who are clever, who can interact with one another, highly educated. You need a metric boatload of money, not just for the development of the tech, but for its prototyping and ultimately its installation and operationalization. We don't have that anymore. We've had a baby bust in most of the world that's 50 years old now. There just aren't enough young people in most countries. And now that the baby boomer generation is moving in retirement, there goes the capital base as well. And if you break up the world because of trade tensions or wars, then their ability to even interact at distance becomes constrained. So I expect the pace of tech globally to slow considerably. There will be some places like the United States that this is less true for, because our baby boomers actually had kids. We know them as millennials. And they are now in that stage of their life where the creativity and the interaction is very important. And so it's not like Silicon Valley is going to die here, but it's not going to move forward at the pace that we've become used to. And a lot of the complementary systems around the world that provide either cooperation or competition simply aren't going to be there in a few years. TSMC, the Taiwanese, they're great at semiconductors. No argument there. However, the United States actually produces 55% of the world's semiconductors by value. So if it's going into a cell phone or a server farm or a laptop, it probably comes from the US. The next tier down is where the Taiwanese and the Koreans are. The Japanese are probably up with the United States. And then the mid-tier, which is for like aerospace and cars, that's primarily Thailand and Malaysia. And the low-end stuff, like if you want, I don't know, a smart blender, that's probably coming from China. So all the Internet of Things, that's all the Chinese stuff. I've always been a little dubious of that personally. I don't need a smart refrigerator, but I would argue we can get by without that. Now, there's a lot of pinch points in all of this. But let's talk about Taiwan specifically. If the Chinese were to capture Taiwan tomorrow without a shot being fired, they could not operate TSMC. If they could do something of that technological level, they would have done it years ago already. The Chinese will participate in any manufacturing that they can do. It doesn't matter if it's cost effective, they'll subsidize it because for them it's more an employment issue more than anything else. And the jobs that the United States has lost to China are ones that were in industries where the Chinese can compete. And everything that's left is something where they can't. The same goes for Taiwan. So overall, I'm not overly concerned about that, at least not from an economic point of view. I don't think that's part of the Chinese rationale. Also, all the designs that are implemented in Taiwan, or either done in the United States or done in Japan. So you'd have to assume that the Americans and the Japanese would then become complicit in the invasion. And I think that's a bit of a reach. Beyond that, the Chinese Navy, while they do have more ships than the U.S. Navy, most of them are very, very small, and 90% of them can only sail 1,000 miles from the coast, assuming they're sailing in a straight line, moving slowly to conserve fuel, and no one is shooting at them. So they can't even make it past Vietnam in force. So in the instance of a war, whoever the Chinese would be warring with, someone, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Indians, us, someone is going to put a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy line. The United States hasn't been the world's top energy importer for a long time. It's been China. China imports 85% of their energy, and 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf. So in a real war, that stops. And China literally deindustrializes in a matter of months. The trucks stop running probably in less than 3 to 6 months, and you'll have mass famine in 6 to 12 that'll kill 500 million people. Now, normally I would say that this would prevent the Chinese from seriously considering any sort of conflict. But as we're ending the edge of the globalized era, the math is changing. They realize now that they don't have a lot to lose, or more to the point, they're going to lose it anyway. And there's something to be said for choosing the time and place of the conflict so that you can write the narrative. And if for the low, low price of 500 million dead Chinese, the Communist Party can remain in control during the transition, that's a price worth paying. So I'd give it like a 1 in 3 chance that it's going to happen. Let's start with the Chinese view about what's going on. When the war first started, they were really excited because they had always seen this as a potential template. You know, the Russians conquer Ukraine quickly, the world sucks it up, and Ukraine ceases to exist. The Russians absorb it. The Russians pay no real diplomatic or economic price, and we go back to a multipolar world in which the Russians are bigger, and everyone has just decided to accept the done deal and move on. Yeah, that's not happening. So number one, Ukraine, while they're massively overperforming, has really only been preparing for this war for 8 years and did not have a lot of financial resources to do so. Taiwan has been preparing for war with China for 75 years, and they are a wealthy country, and there is not a flat land border between China and Taiwan. It's an ocean. So there's always going to be a much higher level of casualties and a much higher level of difficulty, and now the Chinese know that. 2, the sanctions. I got to admit, I'm really surprised that the world came together, especially Europe, in the way that it did so quickly. If those sanctions were put against China, it would destroy the regime. Say what you will about the Russian economy, but it is a large net exporter of energy, foodstuffs, and the stuff that is necessary to grow foodstuffs. The Chinese are huge importers of all of those things. So the same exact sanctions put against China would destroy the place in less than a couple of months. But I think the one issue that has terrified the Chinese the most is that the boycotts. Everybody's left Russia, and that is the development model for China. They need that for the market access. They need that for the technological transfer. If they didn't have foreign corporations operating, they'd be dead.